What's music without a bass beat to groove to? What's a blockbuster movie without a kicking, butt-whooping boom to pop you out of your seat? Without a serious subwoofer, you could be missing out on, well, some of life's finer pleasures. We're going to show you how to build a subwoofer fast and cheap on this episode of System. Welcome to System. I'm Patrick Norton.
And I'm Dave Calkins.
Bass grooves, battle scenes, yo-yo monticello. Bass is critical in any audio setup. Good low-end extension adds a certain something to movies you watch or any music you listen to.
Great subwoofers can cost quite a bit of cash. Experimenting with building your own enclosures can get very expensive if you make any mistakes. Plywood and MDF are not cheap. We want good sound and the ability to experiment with different sizes of enclosures on the cheap. To do that, we're going to play with something called Sonotube and the usual pile of parts.
So Sonotube is basically giant cardboard tubing. It is designed for building, basically it's a concrete form material. It comes in 10-foot lengths.
If you're building a great big building and you've seen those, the big
right.
pillars in the middle of the building.
It's a giant length of this stuff.
And then they cut it down the side, peel it away, and you have your concrete pillars.
This probably looks familiar to you. This is 18-inch Sonotube.
I actually built my R2-D2 using this. It's very sturdy stuff.
And they have an unbelievable array of sizes, including the size of the subwoofer we're playing around with today, which is 12-inch Sonotube. A big part of the inspiration for this project is a guy named Nelson Pass Labs. He's an epic, amazing audio engineer, and he had a bunch of subwoofers and was experimenting with Sonotube. 10-foot lengths of Sonotube. The original product was two of them, two collections of like 4 subwoofers each and 10-foot lengths of Sonotube. The project was called El Pipo. It's amazing, and it's not going to fit in my truck, at least not while still being able to drive it. So we're scaling things back a little bit. We're going to start with a really nice, really inexpensive subwoofer designed for car audio use. Shoe Research, the ASW 1203. One of the really cool things about Shoe Research is they make amazing subwoofers. Mostly they actually do, this is like the only raw-based speaker they sell. They normally sell pre-built enclosures. I called tech support. I got Dr. Shoe on the phone.
That's awesome.
It was so cool. 175 shipped to your house, which isn't bad considering this thing weighs like 15 pounds. The Sonotube we're going to use for the enclosure. We're using plywood for the end caps. A lot of people, and almost all commercial, like inexpensive commercial subwoofer enclosures are built out of MDF. I hate the stuff, and plywood is stiffer, which means it's going to resist flexing a lot more. We're not going to have to play around with bracing it, which is really nice. Car audio amp. Didn't you used to sell car audio equipment in a previous life?
I did, in fact. I was an audio engineer for the good guys and independent. And no matter what you do for your subwoofer, if you've got a crappy amp powering it, it's going to sound crappy. So really do not get like a $120 amp to power your giant subwoofer. You really want to get a better amp, in the 200 to 400 watt range, something that can really power the kind of subwoofer you're going to run. If you have a $20 amp, it's going to sound like a $20 subwoofer, no matter how good the subwoofer itself is.
Or if your $20 amp distorts a lot, you're going to melt down your subwoofer no matter how expensive it is. This particular subwoofer was designed to be used with a sealed enclosure, which gives us a couple things. One, simpler construction. Two, it also means it's not going to be as efficient. You're going to need more amperage, or basically more watts actually, out of your amp to deliver the same sound pressure level out of it. So I'm going with my personal favorite. JL Audio makes amazing amplifiers. This is a 500 watt mono amplifier designed for subwoofer use. And I just want to thank Craigslist for making it easy to find used audio gear being sold by kids who are upgrading to 1,000 watt amplifiers. Yay. If you can, when you're buying your Sonotube, you can actually, if you know the lengths you want, you can usually get it pre-cut from the people selling it to you.
It is very hard if you don't know what you're doing to cut Sonotube, especially cut it perfectly flat along that circumference. So if you can, make sure you know the length and have the professionals cut it for you.
Two, you're basically going to be creating giant circles. And the easiest way to do that is actually if there is a router attached. If you own a router and a router attachment that plugs into the middle of your plywood and basically carves out a disc, your next best option is a zip tool, a Dremel tool, freehanding with a router, or a jigsaw.
No matter what tools you use, make sure if you're not using a perfectly accurate tool that you cut the hole a little bit too small.
Yeah.
because if it's too big, you're going to let air out, and that's going to make your subwoofer sound like crap. So if you're using something like a Dremel and you're just following a line that you've drawn, make sure when you cut it just a little bit too small. And that way you can sand it out to make it bigger.
Or if you're making a plug, cut it a little bit too large.
It's always easier to make a small hole a little bit bigger than it is to make a too big hole a little bit smaller. And so when you're slotting your sonotube into your actual MDF or whatever you're using, that's the key there is you want it as snug a fit as possible. It'll take you longer, but it will sound better.
To help out with the whole not having any air, basically, especially with a sealed enclosure, you want no air escaping anywhere from it. Two more things we're going to have: glue. Gorilla Glue is our usual standby in the workshop, and basically silicone, like tub silicone caulk. And then basically you run that around all of the seams inside of the subwoofer that you're building, and basically it's your last line of defense against leaking air. One last thing you're going to need is some kind of, well, like a speaker terminal plate and some wire so that you can actually plug the signal from your amplifier into the tabs on the subwoofer. Dr. Hsu was kind enough to tell me that 16 gauge wire should be more than enough to connect to this, and we'll see what I've got in the giant magic box of copper. I'm sure we can find some 16 or 12 gauge wire. So, are you ready to get your lab on?
I love the workshop, my favorite place in the world. Let's go.
The trick to getting a good design for your subwoofer is reading the manual for the actual subwoofer, the driver itself. Well, you can use Sonotube to create ported designs. The Hsu ASW1203 was designed for a sealed enclosure between 0.5 and 1.5 cubic feet. So that's what we're building. Generally speaking, a smaller enclosure requires less power to drive at the expense of some low end, and a bigger enclosure will give you more boom but won't be quite so tight, and it'll want more power. If you want to get your math on and make use of pi to figure out the volume of a cylinder, i.e. the volume of the enclosure you're going to build and the length you'll need to cut your sonotube to, by all means get your pencil out. For everybody else, head to the excellent volume calculators at either the12volt.com or hometheatershack.com. We've got links in the show notes. Type in the height and diameter of your cylinder and you're good to go. The enclosure we're building is starting at the smallest recommended enclosure for our subwoofer, a little over half a cubic foot or 9 inches of 12-inch sonotube. Our second enclosure will be at the maximum recommended size using either 18 or 20-inch sonotube. If you have a table saw, sonotube is easy to cut. Set the gate to the cylinder height you need, hold the tube with both hands, slide it onto the saw blade, and gently rotate it 360 degrees. We were delighted by how smooth the cut was. You could also use a circular saw, a hand saw, or, well, get creative. You've literally just eliminated building 4 sides of a box, but you do have to cap both ends of your tube, which means cutting circles. If you have a router with a circle guide, cutting the caps for your tube will take minutes. Somebody liberated ours from the workshop, so we reached for a zip cutter which still had its circle guide. Unfortunately, it had a dull blade, which broke, and we didn't have any more, so we moved on to cutting the holes freehand with a router. Dave decided we should build end caps instead of plugs, so we cut a circle the diameter of the outside of the tube in 2 squares of plywood a little bigger than the tube, then cut 2 more squares for the actual caps. Into one of those squares, we cut a circle just wide enough for our subwoofer's cage to drop into. Several years of freehand routing later, we were ready to glue up our enclosure. We highly recommend wearing gloves for this, and you'll need a wet rag to wipe up excess glue. We spread our glue according to the directions on the container, aligned our wood, and clamped it down. Next, we slathered glue on the inside of the lip where the sonotube was being inserted and slid the tubing into place. The lid for the opposite end followed, glue and clamp. And we grabbed a second set of hands to hold the ends in place while we used one last pair of clamps to hold our sandwich of end caps and tube together. If you don't have a giant pile of clamps around, you can do a lot with a single pair of clamps. Just do one section at a time. First one end, then the other end, then all 3 pieces together. The process got a bit messy, especially since I slathered extra glue in the exterior joints between the tubing and the end caps. That was more than a little overkill and made for more than a little cleanup. But it's inspired me to use liquid nails and contractor's cement for the next enclosure. Harder to scrub off than glue, but it won't drip. With the enclosure glued up, I crimped disconnects to some 12-gauge copper. 16-gauge would have worked fine, but we had the heavier copper on hand. Then got into overkill mode and soldered the disconnects to the subwoofer tabs. The next morning, after pulling the clamps, I routed a hole for the terminal plate, marked the screws for the subwoofer's cage, removed it, and drilled holes and mounted it in place with number 12 screws. I pulled the wires through and soldered them into the terminal plate. Does it work? Yeah. That's 30 hertz going up to 150 hertz. Somewhere around 26 or 27 hertz, it really fades out, kind of drops off. So my next step is going to be filling that with polyfill That's going to make the enclosure seem larger to the subwoofer. See how that sounds, then to build the next enclosure, which is going to be at the maximum recommended volume for this, or 1.5 cubic feet. I'm also going to be using this, a circle router guide, which means it should take us about 15 minutes to cut our wood plug for the ends before we glue it up, instead of like 3.5 hours. I'd like to apologize to Serafina and Roger for that. And Dave, next time you tell me, oh, it took you hours, it was just end caps, I'll remind you of a certain project you spent 12 hours on. So yeah. All right, not counting the polyfill, we're looking at like $20 in plywood, $10 in sonotube, maybe another $5 in glue and screws. So we're talking maybe 50, 60 bucks for 2 enclosures. Not a bad deal. Took us a little bit of time, but hey, you know what? It's a hobby. Let's go back into the studio. One thing we forgot to show while we were in the workshop.
Wrapping this in Muppet fur.
So do I, actually. I know exactly where to get Muppet fur too. That's the scary part. Is polyfiber fill. If you're a speaker builder, you probably heard the phrase "stuff to taste" at one point or another, which is the idea that, well, it's interesting. If you open up a speaker, there's almost always like fiberglass insulation or polyfill fiber. It's essentially polyfiber used to stuff pillows. You pick it up at a craft shop, anywhere that anybody you know who knits or makes pillows and stuff, you can buy it there. And
Quilts.
basically, around a pound of it per cubic foot, what it does is it slows down the movement of air inside of the speaker and makes the speaker enclosure essentially acoustically behave as if it's larger, up to about 40% larger than the actual physical size. It's a really neat trick, and basically you can experiment with putting more and less polyfiber inside the speaker to see just exactly, well, basically stuff to taste. What sounds the best to your ear. Just make sure it's non-flammable, which is why I suggest polyfiber and not the 1970s era insulation that you found leaking out of the attic. Learn how to build the perfect tool for network analysis, penetration testing, or just plain corporate espionage. It must be the young men and women at Hack5, and their newest episode features a curious plush primate housing a hacked router of doom. Catch new episodes of Hack5 every Wednesday at noon Eastern at revision3.com/hack5.
And as always, if you have any ideas, comments, or suggestions, please email us at system@revision3.com. Don't forget to visit the forums at revision3.com/forum and visit our archives at revision3.com/system.
I'm Patrick Norton.
And I'm Dave Hawkins.
We'll see you next week. No more waking up naked in the wrong state.
I have fallen from the sure faith.
Oh, can someone prepare a battery from a packet starts blinking, you guys? Okay, and on 3. Oh, that's really trippy.